Thanks, Stephanie, and thank you to everyone for having me here, the Quivera Coalition, HMI, and the American Grass-Fed Association. I'm going to hopefully skip through a few slides. I was just going to start with our story, just a brief overview of complexity, barriers to adoption, risks in agriculture, how to design a profitable business, and some of the ideas that I'm developing on back learning, and also planning and producing a profit, and then a few examples to finish with. So it might be a little bit too much, but I'll see how I go. I live down in Tasmania, right down the bottom of Australia down there. It's the last stop before Antarctica as climate change and fires are driving us south. And I've got cattle in New South Wales in that middle state. I work in most of the areas that aren't the solid green, and even in some of the solid green areas. So I was trained by Alan when he was with Holistic Management International, also an educator for the Savoury Institute, and managed the Native Grass Association, and also on the board of the Regenerative Ag Network of Tasmania. So lots of not-for-profits as well as for-profits. There we go. Just quickly, what I'll be talking about, in complexity there is no right answer, and most things are right in context. So I just wanted to make sure that we were talking about that. The best way I find to think about complexity is that the definition of insanity does not apply. It is impossible to do the same thing twice. You cannot graze the animals at exactly the same time with exactly the same thing. So I keep telling myself, the definition of insanity does not apply. The only practical way that I've found of managing complexity is with the checklist from the Holistic Management Framework. I'd strongly recommend, I think that's a key habit, that I see people spending a lot of time getting up to the key habits in different areas, and I'm saying you must start today addressing that key habit of using the testing questions. So, just quickly to summarise, are you looking at the root cause of the problem? Are you addressing the weak links? Are you comparing options? I find people compare options to justify what you're doing. I always have this thing that we love to justify what we're doing, and especially if you're a Y chromosome carrier, I want that machine. So, it doesn't make a profit. Where's the energy and money coming from? Is it going to create that landscape that we need? And then how do you feel about it all? So that gut check. So I'm strongly recommending that we start with key habits. The thing that I see when people fail using the Holistic Management Framework, it's because they're not spending enough on that research step there. So I've tried to say that checking, using the checking questions is about 1% of the work you do. It's crucial to do, but you've got to do that pre-work as well. Have you selected the right actions? Have you done the conventional research? This is barriers to adoption. And I'm seeing that it's not the people that are at fault that don't improve their landscape health, their business health, and their social health when they listen to me. It's actually me that's the problem. I think we need to blame the sender, not the receiver. I see that blaming people for not understanding my training is a bit like blaming the victim. So I try not to do that. But this is a really important point, and I'll keep coming back to it, that I get people to act. They must do something. So if they're blocked, if they're stopped, how do they act? How do they get that thing? So I'm really strong on what is it that you can do? What are the safe to fail trials and practice areas and everything that you can do to see if it works in your business? This is Doug Mackenzie Moore's work, and these are the barriers and these are the tools that you can use to address those barriers. The people I work with, it is not lack of motivation. It is not, in my experience, mindset. Because if it was, you could provide them with incentives or get them to make commitments and they would regenerate their land. And I do not see that at all. So it is not lack of motivation. They've already come to something that's got a funny name and they're really really motivated to regenerate their business and their land. I do see a lot of people that forget to act. I think we're overwhelmed with the amount of work that we've got and we forget to act, and I get significant change by just providing prompts. It's also the people that come to holistic management training, it's usually not lack of social pressure as an issue, so I don't see that as being a one. Lack of knowledge is something there, but it's got to be knowledge that's been gained on your own land with your own experience. But the one that I see, number one, is structural barriers. It's got to be convenient to do things. And I'm going to be talking about finances, and the biggest problem and the reason people fail is because it's not convenient. So I'll come back to that. The other ones, it's got to be convenient to get together and make decisions, and it's got to be convenient to move the animals around the landscapes. Some of the fencing designs and things that I see out there are just not convenient to use and to do that. So just risks in agriculture. I have a real thing that we need to focus more on risks. So these are the three main risks. It doesn't include sort of a lot of the other risks, but these are the main ones. So debt seems to be the tail wagging the dog. Even with really low interest rates, I'm finding that people still trying to make really risky decisions. They try to pay off the debt with one throw of the dice, and it just doesn't work. So you need to make sure that you've got debt down low. Seasonal risk, especially in Australia, rainfall, so drought in Australia is the next risk. You have other seasonal risks that we don't have. A lot of the time we're not worried about snow for the majority of Australia. So, and then the third one, market price. But that statement there from Dr. Tim Hutchings, he went and did his PhD in risk in agriculture as a succession plan to hand over the farm to the boys. So, he's not your average farmer. But, farm viability depends more on minimising losses than maximising production. I find that we're still focusing on production. There's a successful design, and I'm happy to talk to people later about this, but this is from a farm family in New South Wales, and they can buy as much land as they want and expand as much as they want now. So they've only carry 20% debt on the land, and they breed up their own cows. They actually bring in other people's cattle to handle all the different risks until they have their own cows. It's only their own cows that like to run in those really big herds. They have long recoveries between grazing events because that evens out the rainfall, the soil moisture and temperature. We're managing leaf emergence rates, and so those longer recoveries results in people growing enough grass, never running out of grass, but also having enough time to react when the seasons change. I think that's a really a big breakthrough for me, is that the recovery time is about people as it is much about grass. So a lot of the people I work with, if they're on sort of 3 or 4 month recoveries and they notice that it stops raining, they then leave it another month to check if it has stopped raining. And then if you're a Y chromosome carrier, you've got to mourn for a month because the animals have got to go. And then you take another month to call the trucking and the livestock agent. So, and by then you've run out of grass. So it's giving people enough time to catch up is also got to be included in the recovery times. And he has an incredibly low cost of production. So everywhere I go, the cost of selling something is 90%, and there's only 10% left over for the profit, whereas the people that are doing a really good job, their costs are less than 10% of their selling price. So they're getting back to that 10 cents in the dollar is the costs, and they keep the 90 cents in the dollar. So how do they design for that? That's really interesting, and I'll try and cover that a little bit up further. This is what I do when I work with people, and it's in conflict with a lot of the advice that I used to give. I don't think I should have been allowed out, really, maybe without someone supervising. But so when they start off, and we call it set stocking or continuous grazing probably in America, what I do is I get them to reduce their stocking rate. In the high rainfall zone, there's usually, if there wasn't a plant there, we put something there. If there wasn't a perennial grass plant, we planted it. And they're usually overstocked. So there's a flip here between the high rainfall zone and the lower rainfall zones, what we would call our arid areas. In the arid areas, it's very easy to increase stocking rate. In the high rainfall zone, initially you have to lower stocking rate. But what we do is we try, and I've tried to show that with that sort of bar graph there, is that we lower the stocking rate by a third, but we double the gross profit per head of animals, so whether they be sheep or cattle. So even though you've come right back, you've lowered all your risks. Intensity increases your risk. It increases your market price risk, your rainfall risk, and usually leads to more debt. And then once they start doing planned grazing, they can double their gross profit per head. And then once they start selecting for the genetics and selecting the phenotypes, they actually go up another notch as well. And then when all of that system's in place, we can see whether it makes sense to increase stocking rate, and I get people to tinker. So most people, when I start working with them, they're overstocked, so I get them to take out 10, 20% of their animals. Did their profit go up? If their profit went up, I get them to take out another 10%. So most of the problems I see with risk in Australia is that we're over-intensified. It's only where you've got no rainfall risk does increasing intensity work. But that's okay. I feel like I'm going really fast. Am I talking too quick, or is that... So this is, I think, identifying the key habit, and this idea, if anyone can come up with a better name than back learning, I think that'd be really good. I'm saying let's find out what is the key habit, what works. Doug Mackenzie Moore calls it the non-divisible end state behaviour. And I looked at him and he said, "What?" And I said, "I knew all the words, I just don't know what that means." So I've translated it into key habit. So what is the key habit? It usually has a very high impact, but it usually has quite a high difficulty to do as well. So this is this idea, and I'm thinking that once you've identified the key habit, everything else is downhill. So it's easier to get there because you're motivated and driven by this key habit. And I'm not sure if it works for people, but it sort of works for me. So all I'm saying is that in the financials, it's that monthly variance to budget. So what is crunching those numbers, that laborious, inconvenient sort of work? How do you actually do that? How do you get those numbers within the first 5 days of the month so that it's convenient? The people I work with, and I work with people that can download their bank feed and write a macro and put it into a spreadsheet, and I work with other people that don't know what a spreadsheet is. So you've got to design these things so that it works for all the people that we're working with. So for a lot of people, if they can't get that monthly variance to budget, and I give them 3 months when they're working with me, they've got 3 months. If they can't easily do it in the first 5 days, we get the accountant or you pay someone to get that figures for you, because usually that's like $100 tops in Australia to get that monthly variance to budget, and you can save thousands by having that. Then the next step is that monthly meetings to do the control sheet. I think it's crucial that we do that. That's the management step. That's the real management. That's where if you do your own numbers, you put those numbers away, and the next day when you're fresh, you do that monthly control sheet. And whoever has spent adverse to plan's responsible for getting it back on plan, and then the plan will be back on track. There's a whole heap of other steps that we go through before we get to that. And once I find that I've done those first 3 steps for people, they then want to learn those other steps. But a lot of the time, if you're doing it starting from the bottom left of the graph, you never ever get to that monthly variance to budget. So I'm saying start there and let it flow downhill from there. Is that okay as an idea? Do you know, like it's just sort of, I think we're trying to push too hard from the bottom and teach people, or push from the top and trying to get them to learn. And we want them to learn what we think and also in the right order that we think and all that. Whereas I find if you can start to get this key habit idea that, I've lost track of the time, sorry. "30 minutes, wow, I'm nearly finished." I'll have to start doing a few jokes or stand up. So what we, so then planning and producing a profit. So this is this step. I really like, I really like spreadsheets, but I've found that not everyone does. I especially like using this one as a training tool. This was an action on the ground soil carbon project that we were doing with the Native Grass Association. So the purpose of the Native Grass Association is to promote Australian native grasses in agriculture, not for conservation. So we were doing this project, and the only red, I was managing it, and the only reds, for those that can see it, it might not be big enough, was the project management and the project administration, which were both my costs. So I was in charge, as well as sort of making sure that I was 100% over the budget. So you really need to know what those big things are, and then you can start going to that next step. The key step, though, is actually doing that, completing the control sheet, and then taking the action. So this is a very simple example. We had a really wet year. We'd shifted to a new set of cattle yards, and we couldn't get the truck in. It was too wet, sort of. I went down to, I'll go and get the cows in and we'll sell those ones, and too wet. So as it turned out, so it was me that was doing the planning. It's me that was sort of responsible for that. But I've started making sure that I'm really focused when I'm working with people on who is going to fix it. Because a lot of the time, the person spending adverse to plan doesn't get their name under the who. They try and give it to someone else. And I always say you can buy a lot of shoes for the price of a new tractor. So there's a really big issue about making people accountable. So if we've all agreed to the plan, then whoever spends adverse to plan's responsible for getting it back. I know it stopped a lot of my recreational hardware buying once your name starts to get put back under there. So there's a real thing that if you do this on a monthly basis, we have to do a tax report every quarter. We can call it a BAS, and then sort of reconcile and work out how much tax we have to pay the government and how much they owe us. If you wait for that 3 months, it's too late to take action. You've actually got to take action every month if you're going to finish the financial year in a profitable situation. So that's what I'd really like people to be focused on, that. So that's that key step. And I've just put that in the notes so that if you get the thing, so variance to budget, monthly meeting and corrective action is the 3 habits. We do a very simple profit target. So what profit do you need to run this business? You need to start somewhere there. If you don't know what profit you need, so we do things like wages and drawings and debt reduction and longer term savings for education. So this is developed by a friend of mine, Mark Gardner, who's also an educator. He was the year ahead of me in 96, so he started in 95, and I trained with Anne Adams in 96. The logjam for profit is usually that bookkeeping, as I was talking about, but also being able to have meetings. I run a lot of these meetings now with a Zoom webinar, and it's really along the lines of sort of, I try not to think of myself as the referee, but we try and make sure we stay focused on getting the plan back on track rather than trying to blame people. Time to plan a profit's really hard when you're in a business and you're working that hard, and again, one of those barriers is infrastructure. I'd strongly recommend that you learn about the financial weak link. The only way I can get that to work is if you list each issue that you have on the farm under the different categories. So it's just that idea of sunlight flowing through, capturing sunlight as grass in the resource link, turning it into meat, milk or wool in the next one, and then marketing that. It's the same in cropping. I do that when we do a cover cropping training in Australia with Colin Seiss, and I try and make sure that they're addressed. That's only when they've got a weak link, a resource weak link, that they're allowed to spend substantial money on cover crops. Some examples. So this guy here, Stephen Hobbs in southwest Victoria, I was trying to talk him into getting an auto drafter and computer setup, because there's a lot of people making money doing that. So individual animal ID, so that you can rate each animal, each sheep for profitability. I thought, when I went back to this, I thought his barrier was lack of knowledge, because he didn't know how much value it was going to be to his business, when in actual fact it was the convenience. They actually didn't know about Bud Williams and the Bud Box, so just by redesigning their yards very simply, they were able to put sheep up the race, and they would auto draft themselves. So he'd spent 30 years working with his father and lifting nearly every sheep and stuffing it up the race. And now that he's just redesigned it, so a Bud Box design, this is how they flow now. Yeah, well, they're keen to get out. So because they've actually been trained to come in quietly and stuff, they're now that ewe, I really like that ewe that's sitting up going, oh, that's where I'm going over there. So he can stand at the back. A lot of our sheep farmers get replacement hips and knees from handling sheep and drafting them and getting belted and things like that. He can stand at the back now, and they just go and walk through them themselves. So some of these techniques for keeping people healthy and sort of the sheep are calm. They're lining up and queuing and waiting. Everyone says they're not very smart. Well, I think it's the way we manage them's probably the issue. But this is the big financial one. So he now knows. The myth in Australia is that these white Suffolks, this is a meat breed with a low quality wool. They actually are more profitable, but he now knows that it's his merinos with his high quality wool, that one in red there, that are the most profitable. But they've got to have multiple lambs. There's a big jump up from single lambs. All the advice was, don't worry about how many lambs. Don't even worry if they have a lamb. You've still got the wool, and it's really clear when you start to look at this that the most profitable sheep are the merinos with multiple lambs because of the value of the wool, and also that. And there's a really big range within the whole structure. So that dry ewe, which people used to keep because they could still shear some wool off it, they're not worth a lot of money, and the bottom ones of those are worth nearly nothing. They're not paying their way. So now they put all of these on a league ladder, and every time they have to adjust their stocking rate, they actually sell the bottoms of everything. So every time they have a dry spell now, the average profit of the whole farm increases. The average profit, of all the sheep increases, and then they breed up from them. So very quickly they get this massive increase. So the other one is, I taught for a long time, the radial fencing design. Everyone familiar with the cell design, water in the middle and the radial? I don't teach that anymore. It doesn't work in practice. I did I had a group, and half of them wanted to build cells and half of them wanted to build these laneways or these strips, the ladder sort of idea of just skipping the front fence and they can always go back to the water. And And it's incredibly convenient, but it's also required to adjust when you lower your stocking rate. So I don't do that anymore, and I go, gee, there was a lot of people, but this group, so half of them did that. It would never have got through the University Ethics Committee, because they would have wanted me, but I go, well, if that's what you want to do. So I let half of them build cells, half of them build laneways, like I'd recommend, and the ones that were building laneways were going, and their land was improving in 2 years, where the people with cells were still struggling. So some of them were going okay, but they were always worried about being understocked, whereas the people with the laneways, they never worry about being understocked. They only worry about being overstocked. This takes a little bit of explaining. This is satellite data. Now I really like it because it's a US satellite that we've just got the data for, so it hasn't cost us anything in Australia. But there's 3 periods I've tried to look at here. So pre-holistic management training, what I call standard holistic management training, and then what we've been calling practical holistic management. Well, yeah, that went well when Alan saw that, you could imagine. So, yeah, because when people make things practical, as they say, they usually simplify it. But we're not trying to simplify it, we're just trying to bound it so that we know what's going on. So prior to holistic management training, so this is 1991 through to 1991, 1991 through to 1999. So the ground cover was below the district ground cover. It was always falling below. They were always in drought. They were always sending the animals away. They were taking them droving on the roadsides. Then Peter and his father did holistic management training in 1999, and there was a significant improvement in the average ground cover. But it was, what a young woman that works for me says is, it was the yo-yo years. So they could not keep profit in the business at that stage because they could not maintain stable feed and stable ground cover. So at that stage, I believe that they became masters of buying high and selling low. So they'd have rain, they'd grow a heap of grass, then they'd sell them. Dad left at that next red line there, I think, which was about 2012, and then just Peter and I have been there. So Dad moved into town and started another business there. And then we did things like we put in safe to fail practice areas so that we knew what the thresholds for recovery and stock density or animal impact were. We really took control of the business. We designed the fencing differently. We adjusted the stocking rate to get that. So we're using that information from those safe to fail practice areas to populate the grazing charts, so that we were using data obtained on the farm to decide what we're going to do. This is a different way than what I've ever taught before, so that we actually can get that. Since then, he's been able to stabilise the ground cover. He's been able to stabilise the ground cover, but also stabilise the financials. He's now starting to pay off the debt that accrued during the yo-yo years. Then that debt accrued then because they'd get rain, they'd buy a couple of truckloads of cows, and then they'd run out of grass, and then they'd sell the couple of truckloads of cows for a loss. So that's how we've started to stabilise it. So it's very stable. The business is probably never going to run out of grass again. Can you see that at the end of that there's a little dip? It's got a downward trend. So New South Wales has been in drought for several years. So we were running a field day there on the 1st of November in 2018. And I've learnt that I've really got to listen. I have a problem with not receiving the information that people are sending to me. So we'd had another time that back further when we'd first started doing this, that Peter said, it's like that, it dips right down to the bottom. It's the next dip after that. He said, I don't think it's going so well. But he doesn't pay me because he's a friend. So, okay, yeah, righto. Yeah, and just, I'm looking at the grass. He's got a lovely native Australian paspalum grass. But he said, oh, it's not going so well. So I go, okay, let's act. So in a complex situation, you don't have guidelines, you have rules of thumb. So declining ground cover triggered the rule of thumb. So when in doubt, I say decrease stocking rate to increase recovery. You must decrease stocking rate whenever it's starting to decline in ground cover. We also need to know that there's an order that things decline. So really healthy land will have really big perennial grass basal areas and decomposing litter between those basal areas. This is all the research out of David Tongway's landscape function, which is in the EOV and the Savory Institute EOV and stuff. But the thing you lose first is the decomposition, then you lose the litter, then you lose the perennial grasses. So you've got to understand what's the early warning when you're coming back up. So we decrease the stocking rate to increase the recovery, to grow more litter, and then we decrease the paddock size to increase the animal impact to promote germination of the perennial grass seed bank. So that's very hard to do if you're running your traditional cells. I've always found that. With the lanes, it's very, very easy to do, to decrease the paddock size. Because if you've had to, say, reduce the numbers by half, you've got to be able to at least halve the paddock sizes to increase that stock density and maintain it up near those thresholds. Hope that was okay. So what I do then is I'm really cheeky in Australia because I go, this suggests to me that I know what I'm talking about. Because I'm trying to get the farmers to say, yes, you know what you're talking about. Because I think there's a real issue with, there's a lot of noise out there. So we really need to know that that's the sort of thing that, and this is by the end of January, so within 3 months, there was a massive turnaround in the satellite data. So you can use it to backfill back to those things. So from memory, that was all I had. So I've gone pretty quick, so there's plenty of time for questions if anyone's got any. Kurt? Yeah, please.
Thank you, Graeme. That was a wonderful presentation. I was just a little confused with the key concept there. And I love the idea, but I have a hard time in the implementation of keeping, the variance when most people haven't got the idea of planning for a profit yet. So how do you not start down here and get right to there? Maybe you explained it.
I get people to just start with anything, so I'll try and get back to that. So that was that idea of the monthly variance at the top of the sigmoid curve or whatever it is, my hill idea. What I do is I either get them to get their accountant to do a budget, or let's use last year's figures, or let's do it plus inflation, which is sort of irrelevant at the moment in Australia. We're not getting any inflation, and then just see if they can do as well as that. And then I start to put pressure on them to go back and go, oh, well, it's not going to be enough. And then I get that profit form that I was trying to show. What profit do you need to run the business? But I start them. Just get them started. So whatever means. So I agree. You can be starting with a financial plan or a budget, as we'd say in Australia, that really isn't very profitable. But then they realise, well, they can't even match that, and then we can go back, and then you've got their attention. I think it's a bit like training a dog. You've really got to get them to look at you first, and once they realise that they can't do it, then we can go, and then we start doing these other profit targets. But if you don't get that step embedded and in place, even if it's terrible and it's not a great result, then you can't get the other things to flow. So, is that okay? Yeah.
Help me out. The lane design?
Yeah.
Are you speaking of one lane going with several paddocks coming off of it? Or
Yeah,
one lane and then just fencing it off?
Yeah, it's more this, the young woman that came and did her placement for her Masters of Agriculture from Melbourne University, she put this in her presentation for her Masters, which I thought was really cute. And, but so we just do this, Guy, we just have these lanes and we have the water at the back and we just move the cows until they get to that one, and then we bring them back and start them again at the front. Yeah, we can do, or you can run a lane back to it. There's a lot of sheep people that'll be using a dam back then. They just run a lane along the bottom there so that they can always get to the dam. Yeah, and that works really well. And a lot of the time we're putting like that end point there. You might only graze that, once every 12 months, and you might graze the one back here every 6 months, so that people are getting really high quality feedback so that they know, oh, this land responds like this. Because that's what I find is if we're not getting that, so if I turn up at a person's ranch and I say to you, what recovery are you on? Thank you. What recovery are you on? And if they don't, if they'll say, oh, I think it's 120 days. I go, I'm not a think sort of a person. Show me where the evidence is. And I make them, I behave like that. So, as you know, I'm all bright sunshine and laughing all the time. But, I make sure that I really grill them because it's really important that you have this information. So, and I was thinking, I do the same with the grazing. So I put in these safe to fail strips so that they've got that information, and then I sort of give them some training, a clear understanding of what healthy land looks like, and then get them to do road trips and design lanes from there, and then start building some, learning from that, feeding back, but at the same time also selecting genetics that like that sort of management. One more if there's... Oh.
Hi. So how do you work with people on accounting for their labor? A lot of people are adverse to that idea. They're adverse to putting a value on their labor, including that in their cost of production.
Yeah. One of the things, Cindy, that I look for is, so what's their limiting resource? And a lot of the people I'm working with, it's time. So dollars per hour is a really important point. And then I just work through with them to do the dollars per hour. And then we sort the enterprises. One of the steps that I didn't go into is evaluating the enterprises for profit, but also risk. So how often are they successful with that enterprise on their farm with their skills? I know nothing about cropping, but I can teach everyone in the room to be a crop consultant. All you do is you go in and say, how often do you plant that crop and it's successful? Because I'm looking for 9 out of 10 years that you plant it and it's successful. And they'll say, 3 out of 10. I'll say, we'll do less of that. And I go, wow, and they pay me for this. But then what I'm trying to get down to is that people are confusing agronomy with business. So in Australia, a lot of places, the canola, you call it canola, do you? The canola never makes money. And they go, but we need it for the disease break. And I go, we'll put it back to perennial grass and graze it, and we will make a profit while we regenerate the soil rather than degrade the soil by going through the canola thing. So, yeah. And the other one is, Cindy, which is where I thought you were going to go, is that we're starting to look at bat latches and, some of those automatic gate openings and things like that, because it's very easy to set up because the animals are incredibly quiet. And I was thinking, whenever we get a bus of university students, they love to go out and do this sort of stuff and shift the animals and watch them come and walk gently through and score them for all the animal performance things. So it's very good. That's all I had. I hope that was okay. Thank you. Thanks very much.